Good evening. I'm Anna Danziger Halperin, Associate Director of our Center for Women's History. I'm joined this evening by my colleague, Keren Ben-Horin, Curatorial Scholar in Women's History. We're looking forward to speaking with you all about our current exhibition, Real Clothes, Real Lives, 200 Years of What Women Wore, the Smith College Historic Clothing Collection. The exhibition opened just 2 weeks ago on September 27th, and we're excited to have this opportunity to dive deeper into its highlights with you all. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to thank our trustees, Joyce B. Cowan, the Mellon Foundation, our Chairs Council, our Women's History Council, and all our members and other generous donors. Your support allows New York Historical to continue to pursue our mission. We'd also like to extend a special thank you to our collaborators, the Smith College Historic Clothing Collection, and especially curators Rebecca Shea and Kiki Smith. Before we launch into our program, I want to let you know a few logistical details. It'll last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. We've disabled the chat function, so please do make sure to use the Q&A. After the presentation, we'll get to as many questions as time allows. So jumping in, every thread, patch, hemline, or stain that you'll see in the presentation tells us meaningful stories about the women who wore these garments, those who made them, and about the time and place in which these garments were worn. The exhibition, Real Clothes, Real Lives, is a collaboration with the Smith College Historic Clothing Collection, which is a truly unique collection of everyday garments and accessories that are rarely saved or displayed in museum settings. Many of the ones on view are humble, everyday items that were worn by real women over the past 200 years. Sometimes we know the individual stories behind these garments, and other times we don't know exactly their individual provenance. But the stories that they tell are a perfect fit for what we do here at the Center for Women's History. We use historic objects to reveal the lived experiences of women from diverse economic and racial backgrounds, as well as gender identities and gender presentations. The exhibition will be on view for 9 months. Because textiles and historic clothing are very sensitive to light and humidity, many cannot be displayed for more than 4 months. So many of the objects that are on view now will be rotated in January. This design rendering that you see on our screen from our brilliant designer, Sophia Lynn, shows a visual of how our gallery will look different now and after January. Some new objects will be similar to the ones that they replace, while others will tell new stories. Our presentation today will focus on the thematic organization of the exhibition, as well as the objects that are included in the first phase now. Another note, we've created an audio guide on Bloomberg Connects that highlights some of the different objects to bring in additional historical context. You can listen to that guide even outside of the museum by downloading the free Bloomberg Connects app. So jumping into the content, the first section of the exhibition starts at home, highlighting clothes that are only meant to be worn in private, with the earliest examples dating back to the 1860s, and including also some of the most contemporary ones, ones worn in the 1970s. Compared to good clothes, garments that are worn in the home tend to be plainer and far more practical. They show us evidence of women's labor around the house, like washing clothes, tending babies, cooking, cleaning, and more. Most of the garments on view are made out of easy-to-wash cotton and printed patterns that easily contain stains. Some of the garments are homemade, while others are mass-produced. Some have been repurposed, reused, or upcycled. They bear signs of repeated use, worn cuffs and collars, patched and mended elbows, tears, holes, fabric that's faded, etc. But even the most practical and inexpensive garments have often a feminine touch, ruffles, pretty buttons, embroidered motifs, floral prints, things that tell us not only about the individual wearer's preferences, but also some of the norms about what it meant to be a woman during the time period. This dress here is called a morning wrapper, which is one that was rarely worn outside of the house or after midday, in fact. Wrappers were easy to put on and had an adjustable bodice that could accommodate pregnancy, could change with a changing body. Wrappers were comfortable to wear and did not require a tight corset or heavy petticoats to wear them with. On the right side, you can see a rare image of a pregnant woman wearing a morning wrapper outside the home, posing for a family picture. And if you can zoom in closely, you can see she does not look very happy to be having her photograph taken. In an ode to the fact that the Smith College Historic clothing collection is a study collection in an academic institution, our designers, Sophia Lin and Kira Huang, have created an incredible design motif throughout the exhibit that you can see here in this photograph that highlights important elements in selected garments by incorporating text and imagery directly onto the plexiglass or in graphic murals. So here in the small circle, for example, that's above the dress, we highlight the print of the flowers and vines was printed on inexpensive cotton dress, suggesting that the dress was probably purchased ready-made from a mail order catalog. Other elements that these plexiglass annotations call out include the fashionable leg of mutton sleeves, that big puff, similar to those on public dress was from the time period that would have been worn outside the home. So these annotations are a design motif that runs throughout the exhibitions and will be the ones that are on plexi are for garments that are on view on both phases. And the labels also pick up on this academic study collection theme by looking like academic clipboards. We also included objects in the exhibition drawn from New York Historical's museum and library collections. And so here, for example, we have a cluster of objects, a vignette, that demonstrate how technological advances have deeply influenced women's everyday life. Before the emergence of ready-to-wear clothing in the early 20th century, sewing at home was a time-consuming task done by women of all economic backgrounds. The introduction of a home sewing machine in the 1850s was hailed as a technological marvel that could potentially liberate women from this endless form of labor. However, sewing machines were quite expensive. At the time, they cost anywhere between $50 to $125. So they were a significant investment for an average American family and a status symbol as well. In order to make sewing machines more accessible, even to working class and poor families, the Singer Sewing Machine Company inaugurated installment plans with low down payments. So by the 1870s, more than 500,000 domestic sewing machines were being produced annually. The second image from the left shows a trade card, which shows how a sewing machine was depicted as both a middle-class pursuit and as a communal undertaking. In the background of that card, you can also see there is a domestic worker bringing these more fashionable elite women some fabric for their sewing circle. Many makers advertised their machines as elaborate pieces of furniture, and they were proudly presented in middle-class living rooms all across America. By the 1890s, sewing machines were much smaller, so what you see on the very right is a portable sewing machine from 1890 that is quite small, about yay big. One of the rarest garments on display is this blue work bodice from the mid-19th century. It'll be in the gallery for the entire exhibition in a case that has a motion-activated light source that also includes a paper doll from our collection that depicts an 18th century domestic worker or enslaved woman wearing a very similar bodice. There are very few existing examples of this kind of bodice, which was also called a sack or a josie. Very few have survived because they were used by women whose physical work required a bodice that was both loose-fitting and easy to maintain. Although the exteriors of the bodice, the exterior fabric is in really good condition. The interior tells a very different story. The maker used two different lightweight calicos, likely repurposed from children's dresses to create the lining. And even the ragged pieces were patched, and the tears around the waistline suggest that the wear was most likely focused around where an apron would have been tied around her waist. Our home section focuses on some of the ways that traditional female jobs around the house were performed, so-called female jobs, and how the clothes worn to do this kind of work changed over time. So before washing machines were invented, doing the family's laundry was physically demanding, time-consuming, and a very messy job that consumed most of a day. We have objects from our collection as well as aprons from the Smith collection that bring to life this labor-intensive task of doing the family's laundry. The dress that you see here on the left of your screen likely belonged to a hardworking woman in Ohio's coal mining region during the Great Depression. When you look closely at this garment, its colors are faded, except in areas in which a bib apron would have covered the fabric. The cuffs are also worn in the collar. It's truly an incredible feat that this garment survived. And these signs of wear really animate the everyday experience that this woman must have lived through. It's not just a story about her frugality and labor, although the garment is quite frayed and torn, as I mentioned, but its owner did not reuse this fabric or discard it. It was saved. And so that tells us maybe that it was perhaps quite a loved memento. As we move into the mid 20th century, we highlight how clothes meant to be worn in private were nevertheless influenced by fashion trends. So on the right, you can see what's perhaps a quintessential example of a 1950s house dress worn especially for supper time. The apron is a mesh fabric that is see-through, it's translucent, it looks more pretty than practical. It features elastic inserts above the hips that were designed to allow for comfortable breathing while fitting snugly, which reflects the fashionable silhouette of the period. And despite this trendy appearance, the printed cotton dress was easily washed and ironed, mass-produced, and would sell for just $5.99, as you can see in the advertisement. Our second section moves from the home out to what were some of the first socially acceptable jobs that women did outside of the home, work as a waitress, a domestic worker, or a nurse. These jobs are often associated with so-called natural feminine traits, things like taking care of others, cooking, maintaining the home. Women who did these jobs often had to wear uniforms with written or unwritten dress codes, such as the hem length and the apron length, etc. These rules are dictated not by the individual wearer's choice, but by higher ups, and they reflect ideas about appropriate appearance, not individual preference. Uniforms bring your attention to the job itself that's being performed rather than the wearer's individuality, and it draws that emphasis to the position. Compared to women's everyday fashions, uniforms are generally easier to launder and maintain because they're made out of sturdy materials with few frills. The uniforms shown here were designed to facilitate movement required for physical work and feature functional elements like strategically positioned pockets. One of the design elements that we carried through the exhibition, as I mentioned, are these annotated photo murals. These aren't physical garments, but rather printed photographs with text and imagery that highlights the construction and design elements of the garments depicted. And they model to visitors how small details like specific sleeve styles, pleats, prints, textiles, etc., are gateways to understanding the real lived experiences of women across time and place. They allow us to gain a better sense of how people were affected by economic differences, technological advances, and social circumstances. So for this mural of two domestic worker uniforms, we have it paired with a physical pair of leather boots that were worn between 1920 and 1935 by a domestic worker named Minnie, who worked in Long Island between 1920 and 1935. And that's her dress on the left, the longer dress. The boots that are on display show worn out soles, including a hole at the bottom, and show the evidence of years of work and penny pinching. In this installation image, you can see those domestic workers mural in between on the left, waitress uniforms, and on the right, nursing uniforms. While waitresses and domestic workers were considered jobs especially for working class and poor women, nursing, which began to professionalize at the end of the 19th century, although women had across classes been responsible for taking care of the ailing and the sick. In the 19th century, it became an acceptable option for educated women who are seeking paid work. So even though we see some striking visual similarities, nurses would have come from a different kind of socioeconomic background. Some of those visual similarities are because nursing uniforms were adapted from these other service jobs. They included white aprons with bibs covering the chest, detachable white collars and cuffs, and white caps. After World War II, both nursing and waitress uniforms began to be made with new kinds of synthetic fibers, making them more durable and easy to care for. The pink uniform that you can see on your screen, for example, is made out of a material called Dacron, which is a kind of plastic. And there's an annotation that's a zoomed out picture of the label, which has its care instructions. The dress was virtually indestructible, except if you iron it, it would melt. And so now I'll turn it over to Keren to talk about our next section.
Hi, good evening, everyone. So our next section, public dress in good taste, continues to move out and focus on what women wore for public outings from about the 1820s through the 1990s. This is our biggest section, with almost all of the garments and accessories rotating in the second phase. And despite the time period that it covers, the section shows that one thing has stayed constant. Women's public dress is carefully scrutinized and follows unwritten rules specific to class, to age, to religion, and even to locality. And we see how the abstract notion of good taste dictates what was appropriate for women to wear in public. And it actually remains an ever-changing kind of moving target for women across time and place. One of the earliest examples that we have on view is this day dress, and alongside the kind of corset that would have underpinned it. The dress shown here is an opportunity for us at the Center for Women's History to highlight the vital role of enslaved cotton pickers in the southern plantations, who were responsible for the production of affordable printed fabric, such as this one, which was spun, woven in New England, many mills and factories. The 20 million yards produced annually of these kind of fabrics allowed most white women at that time period to own more than one good dress, which was an evolution from earlier periods. It also made cotton an important fabric in fashionable wardrobes, and that will stay even to the present day. the high waistline on this dress, which was so fashionable in the 1830s, meant that corsets had to be made similarly shorter. The corset here, softer, less boning, was fashionable since the early 19th century, but soon it would become longer and more rigid in the 1840s as waistlines started dropping again and heavier petticoats and later the crinolines and bustles were added to achieve this ever expanding silhouette. We included accessories like the corset to reveal the material experiences of getting dressed and how this has changed over time. And outside the gallery doors, we're included a short video featuring our living history specialist, Kenna Libbs, that demonstrates all of the elaborate layers that an elite woman in the late 19th century would wear. And that video is also available on our Instagram account. On changing silhouettes, this later example shows how the body stretches longer in the front and how a protruding rear is achieved with a bustle. And while wealthy 19th century women changed their clothes several times a day, a poor or a working class woman might have saved and repair again and again her only one good dress. And this is one of these examples. Although it follows both the silhouette and the style of the period with this layering of stripes, we know from its seams and the construction that it was homemade. And we can see how resourceful this person was because the dress is patched and it's resewn and it's altered. And it's all of those things are quite visible, and you can see that in the right corner. The seams were left raw. The bodice is lined with faded and torn printed cotton of a different kind. The overdress is patched. It's remade with a long tunic into that gathered bustle shape in the back, following the changing fashions. One other facet of 19th century rigid dress codes that almost entirely disappeared today is the wearing of gloves in public outings. So we have this little vignette that you see on the left, drawn entirely from our collection. And in the mid to late 19th century, women from various social classes regularly wore gloves when they left their homes. Middle class and upper class women paid very close attention to rules of etiquette concerning the length, the color, the material of the gloves when they were removed. Gloves could be made from silk or cotton, from thin leather, like the example that we have in the gallery. And were not only considered a status symbol, but also served to protect hands from dirt and germs. This helped maintain soft, kind of ladylike hands. And having soft hands became a sign that a woman did not do her own housework. And because gloves were very tight-fitting, they required a variety of accessories like glove stretchers, button hooks that were necessary to put on the gloves more easily. We also have on Bloomberg's Connect, as Anna mentioned, a really wonderful audio clip developed by one of our team members, and it dives deeper into the history of the gloves, but also of the women who made them. And some of them became labor activists, advocating for better work conditions, shorter days, and really became major labor activists during the late 19th century. As this section moves into the 20th century, we see how the two world wars shaped women's lives and in turn their clothes. During World War I, women like the Smith alum who wore the wool uniform on the left joined the war effort in roles that required them to drive, to repair cars, to serve behind enemy lines, to provide food and aid and supplies abroad to civilians and soldiers. And they did so wearing more practical and much less restrictive clothes, shaping how they continue to dress after the war ended. This kind of participation in public life, this new participation in public life allowed them to really shed societal stereotypes about the limitations of their gender. And we see the same thing happening during World War II, where with the scarcity of materials like silk and like wool, as well as different kind of restrictions on skirt length and width, that once again, that really very deeply influences what women were wearing. Rayon, for example, became a very fashionable new fiber. Most dresses featured kind of dark, somber colors, shorter hemlines because length was regulated, and very broad shoulders that were influenced by military style. However, materials for hats were not restricted or regulated. And we have three very playful examples in the gallery that show how women had fun with accessories because they couldn't have it with their day-to-day clothes. After the war, American women were expected to retreat back to their stereotypical female roles like child rearing and taking care of the home, doing domestic work. But by that point, their lives have really, really significantly transformed. Middle-class women of the 1950s had greater spending power, juggle their household responsibility like child rearing, and combine that with increased activities outside the home, like volunteering for social and religious organizations. So they needed the right clothes to move quickly between these different spheres of life. So a practical and feminine shirtwaist like the one on the right could be worn with an apron at home, but could easily function as an public dress because it had this like really fashionable plaid pattern and a shape that was also very fashionable with a cinched waistline and a big voluminous skirt. And they could just, take off the apron and go outside and run errands and do their volunteering jobs. The section concludes with a vignette that looks at how women's wardrobes changed as more and more women entered office jobs in the 1970s. And we have pantsuits, we have the pantsuit on the very, I don't know if you can see it very well, but that orange pantsuit, it became gradually more acceptable attire for women, both in professional settings, but also as leisure. And we go all the way to the iconic Diane von Furstenberg dress, first introduced in 1974, but the example we have is from 1977, produced by Saks Fifth Avenue. And the DVF dress, or the wrap dress, as it was known, really was featured these very vibrant jersey prints, and it sold by the millions. It was very enthusiastically adopted by women who, like Diane von Furstenberg herself, were inspired by the women's liberation movement, and they realized they can be both professionally successful but also be sexy in the workplace. Her soft, clingy, this like overtly feminine dress was really a stark contrast to what experts like John T. Malloy, author of a book that we have on display, you can see it a little on the left side. It was published in 1977. It was called The Women's Dress for Success book. And it suggested women wear what women should wear in professional settings. Pants, a skirt suit, kind of masculine, sober colors, covered up. And Malloy advice was based on these hundreds and hundreds of interviews that he conducted in the business sector. And it reflected this broader perception that to be taken seriously in this dominantly male environment, women had to tame their femininity and they should dress in a masculine, kind of dark skirt suit, but they should always have a little bit of feminine touch, like a pussy bow or a silk blouse. And his book illustrates that women entering kind of office jobs had to very carefully tread. They needed just as they did earlier, as we've seen in the section earlier in the 19th century when they first kind of stepped out in public. So moving on to our smallest section, rites of passage, focuses on clothes and accessories worn by women for life cycle events. Gendered and cultural conventions often influence the rules of what is acceptable for events as coming of age, marriage, maternity, and even mourning. However, these traditions, like you will see in the sections, are not set in stone and they have evolved over time. One such example is the non-traditional quinceañera dress worn by 15-year-old Liz Vasquez for her celebration in 2019. This is a tradition that's widely celebrated among Latin American diaspora today. It has roots in Mexico, and typically quinceañera dresses have full skirts supported by hooped underskirts, and they're paired with sparkling tiaras. And also traditionally, during the celebration, girls change from flat shoes into heels, and that is a symbolic transition into womanhood. Liz, however, wore her favorite white Converse basketball sneakers, and she shortened her dress to kind of give herself to sort of like package herself in this youthful look, really defying tradition and also avoiding uncomfortable heels. We mentioned that we have several photo murals throughout, and this is one such example. This one highlights three brides who in the 1970s defied traditions by opting for somewhat unusual bridal gowns. The most traditional one is at the center. It was purchased in Baltimore in a department store, and it was a bridesmaid's gown ordered in white, much to the dismay of the mother of the bride. On the right, the bride chose a mini dress purchased in a small boutique whose owner regularly traveled to Mexico, and that's reflected in that in Mexican embroidery. And on the left, the bride who worked at the museum in Long Island wore just her favorite everyday skirt that she already owned. And we wanted to juxtapose that with a traditional wedding. So we have a bride and a bridesmaid, and it comes from this whole series of paper dolls depicting a traditional wedding, which includes the bride, the groom, bridesmaids, and even the priest. And one of the dolls is kind of shown slightly open, so you could really take a pic of the undergarments underneath. And even though this is what we now call tradition, in the 19th century, wearing white for a wedding was actually a new thing, only started influenced by Queen Victoria, who herself wore white to her own wedding. In the 19th century, unlike today, mourning was a public affair that really crossed all social classes. We have on display a combination of mourning accessories from both our collection and the Smith Historic Collection, from very, very expensive to more modest. And it showcases how elaborate these public expressions of grief were displayed. Jewelry, accessories, some like the bracelet that we have on the left, as well as two of the brooches on the bottom, incorporate human hair. And others, like a set of earrings and necklace, were made from naturally black materials like jet. Our final section looks at clothes that really push the boundaries imposed on women from the 19th century through to the present. Women who wore the clothes that are shown in this section refused to be sweet, refused to be ladylike, or to conform to gender norms, and each in her own way ignored rules regarding behavior, clothing, hairstyles, body display, political norms, and things that were deemed unacceptable gradually become the new normal. So for example, wearing pants. From the 19th century, women started wearing split skirts, like you see on the left, to more easily ride bicycles, to a 1920s woman who wore a three-piece suit tailored exactly to her size and body shape. Similarly, overalls transformed from very practical garments to do work on farms, into a political statement worn in the 60s and 70s by activists in the civil rights and movement, women liberation movements, and into today, it's just a widely acceptable fashion piece that we can just go to the store and buy. Afro or naturally black hair is another example of a style that was originally quite radical and became widely fashionable by the close of the 1970s. And one of my personal favorite audio stops that we have incorporates an archival recording of Keren Spellman, who was a SNCC activist, who speaks about wearing her hair natural and how that in and of itself became a gateway for self-actualization and Black liberation. And we also have a beautiful photograph from our collection that shows real women in the 1970s in Central Park. The civil rights movement and later the movement's liberation and anti-war movements really ushered in new forms of dress in the 1960s and the 1970s. And the spirit was that everything goes, with many women and men making their own clothes, such as a vest that we have. You can see it in the center on the orange turtleneck, was made by a college student, handmade from soda tabs. This was also a period in which collaborations between artists and manufacturers of commercial products flourish. So we have a dress shown. It's the second from the left, features the work of artist Peter Max. And we also showcase clothes worn specifically for protests, like the graphic political T-shirts that we have, and a puffer jacket worn under a red poncho made by Frances Crowe, who was a strong advocate of civil disobedience. And she mobilized hundreds of people against war and violence worldwide and remained an activist into her 90s. And she wore this poncho between 1980 to about 1995 for many of her peace demonstrations. And finally, like most of our exhibitions, we conclude with a question prompting visitors to reflect about how history connects to their own life right now. So we end up with a question about, what do your clothes reveal about your own life? And so we have this kind of faux setting room, faux dressing room setting. We have a small mirror and a dressing table where visitors could really kind of reflect and write down their reflection. So this is it. We're now going to be opening up for questions. So question one, the Smith College Historic Clothing Collection has over 4,000 objects. Can you speak more about how you decided which pieces to feature in the exhibition? Anna, do you want to take that one? You're muted.
Course I am. That is a great question. So this is where we really worked closely with our colleagues at the Smith College Historic Collection, Rebecca Shea and Kiki Smith. The exhibition has a catalog that was published a year ago that takes those 4,000 items, narrows it down to a beautiful catalog, much smaller selection. And then this exhibition pulls from there. And it's a tricky process of, how many mannequins can we fit in the gallery and still meet ADA requirements that allow us to walk through and bring groups through. And so it was tricky. And then with the two phases of the exhibit, making sure that the narrative stays as stable as possible between the two phases. It was a tricky process.
Okay, we have another question. How did you come to the decision to choose such a striking green color to incorporate into the exhibition design?
Well, that's also a great question. So we really wanted for there to be a color for those section panels that are really wayfinding through the exhibit, something that would work beautifully to bring it up, to make it so you can find your way through the different selections. We also, our designers, our brilliant graphic designer, art director, Kira Wang, really believes, especially because with the lighting needing to be low, that we need to use really pure colors to bring it out. And so it was a color that worked beautifully with the other colors that we had chosen, and we wanted a contemporary look that worked with all of the silver in the casework and in the clipboards that the labels are printed on, that look really vibrant and help bring it up to the present. You can't choose a color that is tied to any particular garment or any particular era, because we're covering 200 years and the garments themselves change so much. So it was really important to have something that brings in a contemporary feel, works with the overall design and the design motif.
We have another question. Was a thematic decision made to exclude knitted garments, shawls, dresses, and sleeve collars? It was not a thematic decision, I wouldn't say. I think, again, we have our gallery is very small. There are a limited number of stories that we can tell within that space. And what was more important was not any one specific garment, but themes as a whole. And for us at the Center for Women's History, we don't only focus, of course, the materiality of the clothes is very important to us, but it's also important to us that it's contextualized in a kind of broader women's history. And so this was our focus, and our collaborative work with Kiki and Rebecca was to make sure that these stories, that the things that we pull out of the clothes really highlight the lived experiences of the women who wore them. So that was our main focus. We have another question. Was there any specific intention behind the types of mannequins used to display these historical clothes? Were you trying to convey any type of meaning or imagery with more headless wooden mannequins, or was it more a practical choice? So I can take that one and say that with historical clothing, there are limitations that come from the garments themselves. And we were very privileged that Rebecca Shea herself is a professional mannequin dresser, and she worked with a team of people who specialize in dressing historical garments. Every mannequin was custom made for the garment that it displays. I think with kind of headless mannequins, we don't kind of reflect contemporary ideas of who might have worn them. It keeps the attention on the garments itself. And we do, throughout the exhibition, we have these huge labels, as Anna pointed out. And these labels are elaborately designed, and they show sometimes one, sometimes more examples of real women wearing those clothes. So we didn't feel like the garments had to be necessarily animated in a very specific way, because we did have these illustrations to show how the garments would have been worn. And one other thing that I want to point out, it's a little hard to see in slides, but it's very evident in the gallery. We have several pregnant bodies, as well as bodies that are bigger or smaller. So our mannequins, for example, are not model height, like you would see in other fashion exhibitions. The height of the garment is the height of the person who would have worn it. So when you walk through the gallery, you'll see mannequins in different heights, different body types. And that was really important for us to preserve. So that's all the questions we can answer today. We unfortunately ran out of time. Thank you so much for your participation and for your exceptional support of the New York Historical Society. We also hope that you can join at the museum to visit this remarkable collection on view at the Joyce B. Cowan Gallery of Women's History on our 4th floor. Thank you and have a good evening.